Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. And today we are starting a brand new series which is going to be running over the next few months. It's the history of revolutionary ideas. And by that, we don't just mean the ideas behind political revolutions, though we will be talking about those too. We are going to be exploring revolutionary ideas in religion, in science, in art, as well as in politics. To start, though, two conversations about what makes an idea revolutionary. In thinking about this series, we are going to try and cast the net pretty wide. We want to talk about those ideas that have changed the world, but also upended the way that people think about the world, the ideas that really do make people see the world in a completely different way. And that could be all sorts of different kinds of ideas appearing in all sorts of different guises. So we will be talking about a lot of different kinds of thinking in this series. That said, when I think about what makes a revolutionary idea, indeed, what makes a revolution, I often find myself thinking of an image. It is an image that comes up very frequently in classic uses of the term revolution, though it's slightly fallen away now. And it's the idea of a revolution, not just as a kind of inversion, but as a literal turning of the wheel, a literal making of the world the upside down version of itself. The world turned upside down. That's what makes for a revolution, and therefore, maybe by implication, that's what makes for a revolutionary idea. And certainly that image of the world turned upside down is there in many of the political revolutions, which will also be a subject of this series, the ideas behind them. And we can all, I imagine, conjure up images of what the world turned upside down looks like. The people on the bottom finding their way to the top, and the people on the top being cast down, being pulled down, their statues being pulled down and toppled. There is a toppling. And then the poor or the victims of the regime finding themselves wandering through the palaces of the rich and the powerful whom they have displaced, and gawping in amazement at their gold-plated bathrooms and sitting in their chairs and laughing at their thrones, and all of those different ways in which you can get a complete inversion of a social order. And those inversions often feed on ideas which advocate just such a pulling down and a raising up, a turning of the world on its head. That's one way of thinking about revolutions, and I often find myself drawn back to that image. But then when I think about that image, I realize it doesn't settle anything, because there are so many different ways of imagining what the turning of the wheel means, what the revolution means. Does it mean the point at which top is bottom and bottom is top? Is it that the wheel has gone 180 degrees and that's the mark of a revolution, and therefore a revolutionary idea is one that advocates that kind of upside down or inverted world? So it's kind of a half turning of the wheel. But wheels don't often just turn halfway. And when the victims of the regime are walking through the palaces of their tormentors and sitting in their chairs and laughing at their pretensions and expressing outrage at what they discovered there, that's never the end of the story. The wheel never just stops there. Immediately, all the other questions come up. Who's going to live here? Are we going to pull the palace down? Are the poor going to be allowed to roam through these buildings? Is someone else going to have to take them over? Is someone else going to have to take charge? Is it enough to mock and to gawp and to express outrage? What's going to happen next? And so the wheel keeps turning. So then is the question, a truly revolutionary idea, indeed movement, never is fixed. It's constantly in motion. And the other possibility, which is the really revolutionary moment the bit when the wheel starts turning? Not when it finishes turning, but it starts turning, the idea that nudges it. And it might just be a nudge. A small idea might just release movement, and suddenly the movement is out of control. You're running down the hill, and you don't know when it's going to stop. A revolution, even in that image, which is a powerful image, but also in many ways a crude image, even in that crude image, it could mean so many different things. And this isn't just true of political revolutions. in religion, the greatest revolution of them all, the greatest inversion of them all, Christianity. The idea that really does turn the world on its head in almost every imaginable way. And of course, it has many, many political consequences. We're going to be talking about this in an early episode in the series with the historian Tom Holland. There are many versions of this that at least start outside of what we would conventionally call politics. And it's also true that though it's probably necessary for a political revolution for there to be some revolutionary ideas out there, I don't think political revolutions happen in an ideas-free space. And that's why in this series, we'll spend quite a lot of time talking about the ideas that lie behind the great revolutions. It's also true that there are probably quite a lot of revolutionary ideas that upend the world, the universe, our understanding of the universe, that don't have revolutionary political consequences. In science, we might stumble across, I say we, someone among us might stumble across an idea that really does invert our understanding of the universe, the cosmos. We realize that the thing that we thought was true is no longer true. And actually, we've been seeing it upside down or back to front or inside out or whatever it is. And yet the world keeps turning. Just because we realize we've been seeing it wrong doesn't mean that in seeing it right, we change it. As Marx didn't say, seeing the world differently is not the same as changing it. And it's also true in art, in the ways in which we perceive the world, the light that we shine on it, the way in which we depict what it is that we think is out there. We can depict it in ways that turn it inside out. But it doesn't mean that the thing that we are depicting is turned inside out in the process, at least not necessarily. So in this series, we're going to be exploring all those different kinds of revolutionary ideas, revolutionary potential, and the different ways of thinking about what it might mean for ideas to change the world. Change the world as it is, the world as it could be, change our view of the world while leaving the world untouched? Or is that even possible? If we do change our view of the world, is the world really untouched? Some of these are quite deep philosophical questions with a very long history. All of these ideas have a long history. And to start, this episode contains two conversations with regular contributors to PPF, two of our favorite contributors, one a philosopher, Lea Ypi, a political philosopher, one a scientist, a geneticist, Adam Rutherford, trying to answer the question, what actually is a revolutionary idea? These are two conversations in part about politics and about science, but neither of the two conversations separate off, as you'll hear, politics from science. In neither case is there any assumption that some of these categories are distinct or discrete, the political revolution, the scientific revolution, but nor is there any necessary connection between them. That's what I'm going to be talking to Lea and to Adam about. Both of these conversations start in the same place, as you will hear. I start with the same question to both of them. They do not finish in the same place. So Lea, I'm going to ask you the big question up front as a way into this whole area. What do you think counts as a revolutionary idea? What qualifies an idea for the label revolutionary?
I think the answer to that question is, to my mind, the same in science and in the social world. So both where you have patterns of nature and what I think of as patterns of freedom. And I think of a revolutionary idea as an idea that produces a paradigm shift. So you have in every kind of interaction, whether it's natural phenomena or human phenomena, you have ways in which things happen and assumptions that we make about how those things happen, methods and standards according to which we understand those practices, as I say, whether they're natural regularities or social regularities. And I think of revolutionary ideas as ideas that give us a sense of a shift in how we understand those regularities. And so that produce a new way of thinking about those regularities. And I also think in both the social world and in the natural world that a revolutionary idea is an idea that improves over some pre-existing paradigm of how we capture those regularities. And what produces, I think, the paradigm shift, again, I don't know if I'm unusual in this or whether there are other people who think like me, but I think in both the social world and in the natural world, there is a sense in which the crisis in received wisdom about the existing paradigms and anomalies that take place within those phenomena make us think anew about how to capture the phenomena and what kind of regularities they might be. And a revolutionary idea is an idea that gives you a sense of how to better capture those regularities. So I'm kind of influenced by Kant in thinking that the law, whether it's natural law or laws of society, and revolutions are all about new ways of understanding what the law is, and the law responds to the ways in which paradigm are set and then change because of things that happen.
Isn't a difference between the natural version and the social version? In the natural version, there's a crisis in our understanding of the regularities. We have misunderstood them in some way, or there's something about them that we haven't captured. And so we turn our understanding on its head, maybe, and see it differently. In the social version, we change the regularities themselves. We change the thing that we are trying to understand. Isn't the social more amenable to revolutionary change than the natural?
I think they are both amenable to change, because what changes is how we see things. And so the categories that we adopt to understand what we observe, and the ways in which we think about the method on the basis of which we capture what we observe. But I think you're right to say that in many ways in the social world, the raw material is already from the very beginning made from us. And so there is a sense in which freedom is always there from the beginning. But I still think that when you think about revolutionary ideas in the social world, they are still an improvement over old ways in which we think about those regularities. And so I think, and this is where perhaps the difference between revolution and reaction comes from. I think of revolution as something that, or a revolutionary idea, as something that gives us a better sense of how different values at play reflect different patterns of behavior and improve over time our understanding of those patterns and our understanding of how those values should be reflected in the patterns. I don't know if that's too abstract, but that's how I think about it.
Do you think that bad ideas can be revolutionary? So what is the quality of the ideas themselves for them to qualify for this label? Improvement is one thing, but the world could improve, couldn't it, off the back of ideas that are wrong or not?
Well, so I think of it as if improvements of values, and both extension of values and uptake of values. So I think in that sense, revolutionary ideas can't be bad ideas on this understanding of what revolution is, because revolutionary ideas are always efforts to better understand the world, to reorganize existing systems, to find patterns of rules that better capture existing developments, but always in light of some pre-existing moral assumptions about how people ought to live together and what right is, or how to think about right, how to think about justice, how to think about the good life, and all these big questions that we ask in the social realm. So that's actually the difference between a revolution and a reaction. A reaction takes you back, and a revolution tries to give you a better, more radical understanding of how values and patterns of behavior fit together.
And what about political revolutions then? How, when you think about revolutionary ideas and the history of revolutionary ideas and their relationship to political revolutions, and not just the best known ones, the sort of French or the Russian ones, but those regular periods in the history of human societies when there is a kind of upheaval, a turning of the wheel, an attempt to take a great leap forward in one form or another. How do you understand that relationship? Are the ideas behind the political revolutions always necessary? Are they ever sufficient?
With political revolutions, it's really hard. And for me, the hardest thing about them is that you don't really know that they are political revolutions until they're finished. And sometimes when they're under threat is when you really know that there has been a political revolution. In other words, you only know it when it's being challenged, that there was something consolidated there that is being challenged. And that you can't say when a political revolution is happening, that it is a political revolution even. It may be a crisis, it may be disorder, it may be instability, but we don't really know until some fundamental change in law, in our understanding of these patterns of behavior, has really been entrenched and settled that it was a revolutionary political change. And so I think in that sense, revolutionary ideas, well, they are necessary to start that change, but they're not sufficient. There has to be other things going on at the same time, maybe an economic crisis, maybe a natural disaster. And in any case, even if they're necessary, it's not enough to have them and to know what they are, to know that the political revolution is a political revolution.
And when they become entrenched, so say you have a revolution that turns out to be a successful one and is recognized with that label, and the ideas behind it also therefore become entrenched, do they at that point cease to be revolutionary? Do they then become the thing that revolutionary ideas are required to upend again?
Yeah, I suppose when you have had the revolution, then the revolutionary ideas that triggered the revolution, then they're just kind of part of the status quo. And so it's only for our own, it's almost methodological, the way we talk about them as revolutionary ideas. It's more for purposes of explanation of what has happened rather than because they continue to be revolutionary ideas, because at that point, they are just part of the paradigms. They are what they make the paradigm that then has been entrenched and settled in that status quo. But I think, to go back to your first question, yeah, I think they are important and these revolutionary ideas are needed. And we know also historically that there was always a body of thought and philosophical or literary or historical, and this kind of canon of writing that goes alongside certain revolutionary changes and that we associate to those changes as important triggers, although they're not the only triggers. And in fact, they may not be the real triggers, that may be some other thing, but that's where we go back to counterfactual history and trying to understand what is it that exactly provoked this thing that we then call the revolution.
When you look back over the history of political thought, there are some ideas which produced or helped to produce political revolutions. And there are many, many ideas which have revolutionary potential and which didn't. And some of them were bad ideas, but many of them weren't. And there they are. This podcast is called Past, Present, Future because it's partly about the relationship between the past, the present, and the future. There is this body of thought which exists out there in the past, much of it with revolutionary potential that was never realized. What are we meant to do with those ideas? So are they of any use to us? This is an argument that historians have all the time. Can we draw on the past to kind of kickstart our own thinking about how the world could be a better place, or do we have to do it for ourselves? When you cast your eye back, you're a philosopher primarily, right? Not a historian, but when you cast your eye back over the history of ideas, which is the subject of this podcast, and you see all of the revolutionary potential unfulfilled, what do you do with that thought? Does it make you sad? Does it make you feel like, oh my God, it's there if we could just find it?
It's more the latter. It doesn't make me sad because I think sometimes, ideas need to be there and need to be kept around, and they need to be there as possibilities. And because ideas alone aren't going to change the world, it's important, however, that ideas stay there and that people continue to reflect on them so that when other material circumstances change, or there's patterns of nature change, or maybe the environment changes, then those ideas could be taken up. And of course, they will also be changed as they are taken up. So it's not that they will be always there and they're in flux. The ideas themselves are in flux. But I think when I think, for example, of Kant's perpetual peace and his idea of a peaceful world community and states that interact with each other based on norms of cosmopolitan justice, I think of that as a revolutionary idea that is there, has been there even from before Kant, hasn't been realized. But the power of the idea is really important from a motivational perspective, from a political perspective, in signaling the alternative way in which we could be conducting our relations. And it won't be giving you a specific answer, but it's really the idea and the thought that goes with that idea is really important, that it exists and that we continue to return to it because it motivates us to think differently about the present and about our current institutions.
Two more questions. So these are questions about the present and the future. So when you think about the revolutionary potential of the present, you say that among the things that spark revolutionary ideas are changes in the patterns of nature. So not just changes in our understanding of nature, but changes in the pattern of nature. And it may well be that we're living through an era where there are very significant changes in the pattern of nature going on around us. You and I are recording this on the day that Los Angeles is in flames, but also changes in the patterns of social order as well. So that revolutionary ideas can themselves be sparked by the changes that they're trying to understand. And revolutionary ideas can also spark the changes that mean these ideas take hold, take root. So when you look at the world now, 2025, and think about its revolutionary potential, this is neither or question. You can just say it's neither or both. Is the revolutionary potential in the changes in the patterns of nature and society? Or do you think the revolutionary potential is still there in the ideas themselves? A lot of people look at our world and think we're living through kind of a revolutionary period with no revolutionary ideas. How do you see it?
I think the potential is in the crisis. And the interesting thing about the current crisis that we face is that although we think of them as, there's history there and nature here, exactly what you were saying in terms of climate change, for example, shows us that this is a very simplistic distinction and very dualistic and very sharp, because actually we contribute to the patterns of nature through man-made behavior. And likewise, we adapt our human responses. And those change the way we think about politics, the way we think about right, based on what happens in nature, whether it's pandemics or natural disasters. And so in a way, we don't really have this very sharp distinction between nature there and spirit or history or world or whatever we want to call it. So in that sense, it's worth thinking about the pattern as one, and our place in the world and our relationship to nature as one. And the potential is in the crisis and in the fact that clearly, it seems to me, the paradigms that we have about how we think about states, how we think about markets in their relationship to state are inadequate, because they are not giving us the right rules able to respond to those kinds of crises. Now, that's only one part of the answer of what produces a revolutionary change. The other part of the answer is about agency. And so both theories of change and agents of change. And that's where I think we're actually mostly failing at the moment, because we don't have either properly articulated good theories to be able to capture and to think at this very complex level about the world, nor do we have good theories of agency, of what kind of institutions and what kind of people are required to then take forward those changes. And so I think, that's where I'm more pessimistic.
Last question, which is about the past, the present, and the future. So in this series, we're going to be talking about all different kinds of revolutionary ideas, not just in science and politics, but in art, in religion, and so on. But there is a way in which history tends to be bracketed and parceled up, which is there are revolutionary periods. The late 18th century was a revolutionary period, not just in politics, right? In science and art and religion. The early 20th century tends to be thought of as a revolutionary period. This is partly because there's a kind of flagship revolution that people can anchor, the idea that the world was turning on its head in many ways. But that's also false, right? The idea that history moves from revolutionary periods to static periods, because you can always trace these moments of upheaval back through the decades and the centuries, and you can find that the ideas have a deep root. But when you think about the 21st century now and looking forward, and you try and think about what it would be for this to be a revolutionary period, do you tend to think of it as at least having within it the potential to be one of those ages that people look back on and say they were living in revolutionary times, to use that cliched phrase? Or do you think of it more as part of the overall arc of history in which all eras are revolutionary because all of them contain within them the seeds of the upheavals, and we can never be sure when those are going to come, or even really what triggered them, ideas, circumstances, luck, fate, whatever. Thinking of the 21st century going forward from, we're exactly a quarter of the way through, so we've got 3/4 of it to go. It's a very artificial category. A century is a very artificial category, but thinking of it ahead, what kind of revolutionary century do you think it might be?
Yeah, I find that question, this last question you asked, very, very difficult. And I don't have an answer. And I don't actually have settled views on which of these two models that you presented on what counts as revolution, which in turn shapes how you think about what kind of century we might be living on. Because I think there's something to both of those views that you presented. One, which is that, there is always revolutionary potential and we don't know, and it's there. And it's only because we then it's sort of post factum that we've witnessed the revolution, and then we decided that was the time in which this the only time in which this possible revolution could happen, or that there is something about material circumstances that makes them ripe for development of a certain kind. And the latter view is supported also by, if you think about scientific revolutions and Thomas Kuhn and stuff, he has this view that you have a paradigm in science again, and those paradigms get challenged when too many problems emerge and the paradigm can't do the work that it's supposed to do and the paradigm gets challenged. So this is almost a different view of revolutions, which is the discipline is not always ripe for those kinds of revolutionary interventions. There are moments where the paradigm is more solid and moments where it gets more confronted with problems and therefore also requiring different answers that might change the paradigm. So it's really, I find in science, it's almost easier to answer that question somehow. Or maybe the scientists will correct me on this. So I'm not going to say more on that. But I find in the social world, it's even harder because it's much more messy and much more complicated. And so you can't really say that it's a revolutionary period until the revolution has materialized. And then the story gets told in such a way that it confirms the view that this revolution was about to happen. But if the revolution had not happened, then the story would have been told in a very different way. And so the narrator intervenes and then makes the whole presentation of events very complicated. And so for that reason, I guess it is just a longer way of saying I don't know, because I don't have an answer on this question other than further elaborating on what you said and the difficulty of deciding on which of these two is the case.
You don't have an answer. Do you have a gut instinct? When you think about, let's narrow it, you think about the next quarter of the 21st century. Is it ripe with revolutionary potential in the first sense, or are we, as we always are, living through a time where we may or we may not be rethinking our understanding of the patterns of the world, but that's what it is to be human?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's ripe with crisis for sure. But again, whether it's ripe just because it's ripe with crisis, whether it's also ripe with revolutionary potential, I'm not sure, because you could also have reaction out of a crisis. And so, if anything, if I were to base my judgment on what I see around me, it seems to me to be more of a reactionary time than a revolutionary time, because all those political movements that are emerging and are capitalizing and are offering diagnosis or a way of understanding of the crisis, it seems to me they set us back in terms of values and rights and institutions, how we think about politics and its relationship to society. And so I would say that there is a crisis, but out of a crisis in the social world, you can get a reaction. And I think that's what we're getting now. It's more reactionary.
But then it's also true that a reactionary time on that second account is also a time which contains within it revolutionary ideas.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where it becomes really hard to anticipate, I think. You can't really say theoretically. So what I see theoretically is more potential for reaction. But you're right that because you can't predict human behavior, that it may well be that something very, very different will unfold. And at that point, it becomes a profession of faith almost, I would say. Yeah, I want to hold on to the belief that something better might come out. And so we have to hope in the revolution, but I think reckon with reaction.
So I'm going to ask you the big question, because this is a series that's covering revolutionary ideas on all sorts of different measures and in all sorts of different fields. But what for you is the test of whether an idea counts as revolutionary in your field? What makes a revolutionary idea?
So I'm going to do the thing that I sometimes do in these conversations with you, which is ask for a little bit of special pleading. And that science is a different category to perhaps the other ideas that you're covering. Because my view is that every aspect of scientific research is fundamentally and quintessentially revolutionary, in that the whole basis of the philosophy of science, at least in the modern era, is to test ideas that already exist in order that you upturn them. So you're aiming to prove something that already exists is wrong. And so there is this fundamental aspect to the nature of scientific thought, which says that everything we do has to fall into this category of, well, I mean, revolutionary is perhaps a bit strong for that. But the reason I frame it like that is because I also think that there are almost no grand revolutions in science in the way that there are in politics, the ones that we label when, 1917 or whatever great countrywide coup results in great political change. I think there are a couple, but in general, I would argue that science is quintessentially revolutionary, but in a very quiet, chipping away at the coalface and not, leaping from the bath and running down the street naked, or overthrowing some despotic leader or powerful ruler in advance. But I don't know how you feel as a political philosopher about that.
So I want to ask you two questions about that. I don't think as a political philosopher, but as someone who's trying to put together a series about the history of revolutionary ideas and think about what gets in and why. So you use that phrase upend, and one of the ways of thinking about revolutions is that they turn the world in some ways, or our understanding of the world, on its head. It is the revolution of the wheel. But as an outsider to science, I would think of quite a lot of it as not in the business of upending, but of qualifying, modifying, sharpening, adapting, applying, all of that. And that upending, where it might even be a small shift, and this gets to the second question, which is, are these paradigm shifts? It might be a small shift, but as where it pulls the ground out from under something. But instinctively, I feel that those things are different, but I'm not a scientist. Is it not the case that some of it is qualifying rather than upending?
I think that's the output. So I think that everything you described in the first part of that question was the output of the scientific process. But this is the philosophy rather than how it actually works in practice, because as you say, most people are just chipping away in order to refine a problem. But from a pure Karl Popper view, you are trying to upend something. You take an idea, you formulate the null hypothesis, and your assumption is that the null hypothesis is wrong and you are going to upend it. What actually happens in the process is that you do end up demonstrating that, for example, the theory of evolution by natural selection is still basically right. And here's a tiny, tiny caveat to it, or here's a refinement of the models that it begins to describe. So in that sense, you're not creating a revolution against the totality of the idea itself, but you're testing it. You're testing via experimentation or observation. And in doing so, your approach should be revolutionary. And it's a sort of win-win in that if you fail, then you are refining the idea as it already stands. And if you succeed, then you're upending the idea. And that's the scientific process. So I think approaching it from a revolutionary point of view is sort of quietly inherent in the scientific process. Now, when it comes to the sort of the Kuhnian model of paradigm shifts, it's a funny thing that philosophers of science and philosophers more broadly talk about paradigm shifts and Thomas Kuhn a lot. And I've never met a scientist who's even mentioned him once in the formulation of an experiment or in the design or write-up of a result. So I have sort of mixed feelings about the idea of paradigm shifts. Do they happen at all? Well, kind of, probably. Do they happen in the way that they're framed from people looking into science? Yeah, in a sort of post hoc rationalization. From within science, I don't think anyone thinks about that in the slightest bit. With the one exception of men with massive egos who think that they're going to make their names by proving some big idea wrong, but they always end up being not very wrong.
So this is a version of the post hoc rationalization question, not challenging the idea that people doing this from the inside don't think in those terms. But as you said, in most cases, you go in with the ambition to upend, but you come out with something that is less than that. But sometimes you do upend. And you said, you can think of only a few, but maybe one or two examples, big examples in the history of science. What are the conditions then that make the upending possible? Because if we're thinking about revolutionary ideas, one possible answer to that is that the idea was genuinely revolutionary. Another answer, which I suspect is closer to what you're saying, is all the ideas are potentially revolutionary. And the ones that do overturn a way of thinking, and the thing that has been upended, even if it's a small thing, it kind of concatenates out through not just maybe science, but social understanding and maybe even the ways in which societies are then organized. That depends on other conditions as well. Other things have to hold for that, maybe that little upending within the scientific framework to concatenate out. I don't even know if concatenate out is a phrase that means anything.
No, I like it. I like it, though, because I think it accurately describes the building of the foundations of evidence that in a post hoc rationalization way, we can say, well, actually, that was a revolution in our thinking, because until this point, people thought this. And after that point, people began to think this. But I mean, we will talk about Darwin in full later. But it is reasonable to say that after November 1859, the world was a different place because there was an idea that had not been previously described. I mean, actually, it had been described a year before, but let's just talk about the publication of The Origin of Species. There was a view of the world, the living world, that was fundamentally different to how it was in October 1859. I'm over-dramatizing for effect. But with the benefit of hindsight and 160 or 70 years worth of testing that core idea, we can say that revolution happened and it was enormously significant. But that isn't what happened in November 1859. It then took decades of challenge and the incremental gains and testing all of those ideas that sit within that big framework in order to work out that it was a revolutionary idea. But this is a problem with science communication and the way we talk about the history of science more than anything else, because we want these punctuated events. So the linearity of history is punctuated with these major events in the history of science. which is how we teach science. And it makes every one of those great advances look like a revolution in thinking, when actually I think it's much more like a continuous. Actually, evolutionary biology is a good way of thinking about this, because there was a big academic argument in the 70s and 80s about whether evolution occurred in huge shifts, big bangs, or was just continual. And the two phrases used, the two technical phrases, were phyletic gradualism, which is that everything just changed slowly in a straight curve, or punctuated equilibrium, which is that everything stayed the same, and then there was these huge events. And those events could be a meteorite landing and wiping out the dinosaurs, or a volcano going off. And life is forced to react in a major way. But other than that, everything just trickled along without changing much over evolutionary time. Now, this was a huge debate at the time in the 70s and 80s, and the answer turned out to be a little bit of column A and a little bit from column B, as often is the case in science. But I do also think this is a useful model for thinking about the history of science, because I tend much more to the phyletic gradualism. I'm not even sure I believe in the scientific revolution as a thing that happened. It is described as such in order that we can understand that the difference in thinking 1,000 years ago was significant to how we think today. But by describing it as a revolution, it makes it sound like a bunch of guys got together in the Royal Society in 1683, Robert Hooke and Isaac Newton and Christopher Wren, and they said, well, we're not going to do this anymore. We're not going to be beholden to the doctrinal thinking of the Catholic Church, which has quashed the ideas of rational men for the last however many hundreds of years. That just didn't happen at all. The Galileo story, there's a great revolution, literally a revolution, where he's describing the Earth rotating around the sun rather than it being fixed in the firmament, and becomes the great heretic because he's placed under house arrest for telling truth to power. None of that happened. None of that happened at all. He wasn't charged with heresy. He was asked to recant, and he was put under house arrest, but he was put under house arrest in the palace and spent the rest of his life writing books about heliocentrism, which were published all across Europe. Did it change the way we think about science? Yeah, kind of. Was it the revolution that we describe in the history of science? No, not really.
Do you, when you think about the possibility of revolutionary ideas in science, and completely taking your point that it is oversold in the way that it's conventionally portrayed, the punctuated equilibrium model. But in social science and politics, the punctuated equilibrium model probably still holds, because we have these things called revolutions. When you do a series like this one, the history of revolutionary ideas, I imagine most people think, right, these are going to be the ideas behind the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution. And we are going to do that in this series, but the whole point is we're going to do a whole lot of other things too. But when you think about changes in scientific understanding, even pushing aside the thought that it happens in these great bursts, do you instinctively feel that there should be or needs to be a relationship with social change for the full label of revolutionary to kind of hold, or not?
No, I don't think so, but I think it might be subject dependent. So when you did your episode with Chris Lintott on steady state versus Big Bang, the Big Bang is a revolutionary theory in that no one had thought that before. And the inherent conflict in the model that was being challenged meant that the way people thought about the universe was fundamentally different after the Big Bang had been described and tested and then finally accepted. But that doesn't change anything about the nature of society, and the cultural context in which that emerged is, well, it's not irrelevant, but it's not central. In biology, it is sort of more different. Did Darwin change the way we think about humans' place in the universe? Well, yes, absolutely, because it became risible to think of special creation or to be a biblical literalist. But again, even in the telling of that story, we smooth over the fact that evolutionary thinking had been around for decades before 1859, including by Darwin's own grandfather, Erasmus. What The Origin of Species described was a mechanism by which evolution could occur. But in terms of the cultural context, yes, it did change humans' place in the universe. And that's why I think it is truly a revolutionary idea. What followed, and we've talked about this in the eugenics episode, what followed was a hugely significant cultural change based on people with particular pre-existing political ideologies then had a scientific tool that they could lean on to say, well, this is how we change society, because Darwin has described evolution in not just all organisms, but humans included within that. And therefore, we have a pivot on which we can engender social change. So I guess the closer the research gets to humans, the more likely there is a social change. I'm no expert on the history of psychology, but my reading of Freud is that he's one of the great intellectual criminals of the 20th century. And I think a lot of psychologists agree with me. But was there a huge cultural change as a result of the popularity of his work? Yeah, I think there were real world consequences for millions of people because some of those ideas were employed in discussions about psychology and psychotherapy, and they persist to this day. So I guess, in terms of impact, it depends on how closely related the field is to real world humans.
And the Big Bang, it's such an interesting example. You're completely right. It would be absurd to think that the Big Bang changed the way that human societies are organized. And yet, and we talked to Chris Lintott about this, partly because of the name, the genius in a way of the name. I'm sure from some point in the future, looking back, it will be possible to trace a way in which, not on politics or social organization, but on art and literature and thinking about the human in more creative forms, it did change how human beings think of themselves, I suspect. It is pretty fundamental. It's got nothing to do with us. It's not about us, the Big Bang story. But it is pretty fundamental. And as an image, I'm sure it has actually shaped human understanding, probably in subtle and deeply buried ways that only emerge over time. But what it's not produced is another Russian Revolution, because that would be laughable. And revolutionary ideas do impact human beings way outside of politics.
Yes, and I think that there is a serious discussion to be had about the role of religion in relation to science. And often that is a discussion which is characterized by extreme polarity of views and extreme ignorance or ignoring of the history of the relationship between science and religion. Because, of course, almost all research in science historically has been under the purview of the church. The single biggest funder of astronomical research in history is the Vatican. And the Galileo story, we pluck out and say, well, here's the beginning of the scientific revolution, or one of the landmarks in the scientific revolution, where we shun doctrinal thinking that is derived from the authority of the Pope or God or whoever. What I do think is interesting is the observation that there are many more religious physicists than there are religious evolutionary biologists. And so what we see is that ideas such as the Big Bang are much more coherent if one is not a biblical literalist, but is religious, and maybe has views which are sort of deist in their foundations. There are many more physicists who are religious than biologists who are religious. And so I wonder whether the narrative from evolution by natural selection being discovered and described, the difficulty in believing in special creation or any form of biblical creation, or indeed Islamic creationism, they are much less coherent stories if evolution is correct and real. Whereas it's possible to align a lot of cosmology with religious thoughts I think if you don't think too hard about it. But this sort of thought process is derived from the observation that physicists who are also Christian occur at a far greater frequency than evolutionary biologists who are also Christian. And I don't really know the reason for that, but I think it's worth thinking about.
I want to ask you a last question, and I'm not even sure it makes sense in the light of what you've just been saying and we've been talking about, but it's a question that sort of preys on my mind, and maybe it's just about how we use words. But do you think that bad ideas can be revolutionary ideas?
It's a fascinating question, but I think it's hard for me to, as a scientist, to parse it, because I don't mean to be so glib as to say there's no such thing as bad ideas. There clearly are. You've done many series that I've contributed to on the history of them.
Exactly. For you to say that now would be a little bit of an upending of your previous position.
Yeah. I fully recant on all of those previous bad ideas. But I think in terms of scientific research, rather than the sort of political manifestation of research, which definitely can be bad ideas, I think that the notion that there are inherently bad ideas within the process of gathering evidence for a challenge to what is accepted in science already is problematic, because the point about what we do in research is to be wrong. right? You want to create a challenge to something, and the aim is to be wrong because that gives you a basis from which to be right. In a trivial way, I always think about how politicians never U-turn. It's the mark of disloyalty and ill discipline and just being a terrible politician. Whereas the mark of being a good scientist is to be as wrong as often as you possibly can and to change your mind based on why you were wrong because the evidence has been supplied. So an example I would give for this is that when we learn evolutionary biology at school, we learn about Lamarck. So the French biologist pre-Darwin who described the acquisition of traits through a lived life, rather than them being passed on and modified in between generations. The classic example is that the giraffe stretches its neck to get the juiciest leaves, and therefore it gets a longer neck and it passes on its long neck to its children, who also do the same process, and over generational time, the neck gets longer and longer. Or in human terms, the blacksmith who spends his life hammering metal, so has massive arms, and passes his massive arms onto his children, and blacksmiths have massive arms as a result. Now, we now know that that is not what happens. Darwin's natural selection described that the characteristics aren't acquired during life. They are random mutations, variations in populations, which are passed on from generation to generation and selected by this blind process. We in the UK mock Lamarck for being wrong, for having an idea which was clearly wrong, well, subsequently shown to be wrong after a better idea came up. And this is deeply unfair. Lamarck was a great scientist and he was thinking hard about these things, and he based his argument on the evidence available to him. Interestingly, in France, where Lamarck was from, they celebrate Lamarck Day as much as they do Darwin Day, which is February the 12th. Because he's one of their boys. But I've always hated the fact that we take the piss out of Lamarck because he came up with this idea was wrong. It was good that he came up with an idea that was wrong. It was based on thought. So it wasn't a bad idea at all. It was just a wrong idea. And if you're a scientist, you should aim to have as many wrong ideas as possible.
But then when Stalin decided he was a Lamarckian because it suited his project, it was then a bad idea.
It absolutely was. But that isn't the fault of Lamarck. It's the fault of not doing the work to understand how it had been corrected.
Well, it was the fault of Stalin, to be honest.
Well, sure. But it was also, and Lysenko is the guy that we blame for that. But Lysenko was wrong about something that we already knew. Now, you're right that in the future, we're already in a situation where someone like RFK Jr., who has some deeply misguided and wrong views about the nature of, for example, vaccines, that have been disproved 1,000 times over, hundreds of thousands of times in huge clinical trials. Some of the biggest scientific experiments in history have shown that vaccines are pretty much, apart from sanitation, the most effective health intervention that humans have invented. So vaccines aren't a bad idea, as long as you do the work to understand how they work. The repercussions of it could be absolutely catastrophic with someone who is wrong about them in such a position of power.
A lot of what we were talking about just there, we are going to be coming back to, but we're going to be coming back to these questions in relation to particular ideas, some of them very big, some of them not so big, some of them obviously world-changing, some of them maybe not so obviously world-changing. In this series, we are going to be talking about Christianity and Islam. We're going to be talking about the American Revolution and the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution. But we're also going to be talking about Surrealism and Bauhaus. We're going to be talking about scientific ideas, big and maybe not so big, scientific ideas that clearly change how societies end up understanding themselves, and maybe some that only do that remotely or distantly or under the surface. There's a lot to talk about in this series. I'm really excited about it and looking forward to it. We're going to start with 2 episodes that go back to the beginning of the story, because I'm also going to try and do this chronologically, insofar as it's possible. It may not always be exactly possible to keep to sequence, but we're going to try. This is a history of revolutionary ideas from the ancient world to the 21st century. Our first 2 episodes are about 2 revolutionary ideas from the ancient world and what they mean not just then, but now, and potentially even for the future, past, present, future. The first is a conversation with the philosopher Agnes Callard about Socrates, but more specifically, the idea of the Socratic method, how revolutionary it was when Socrates was doing it, but also how revolutionary it could be for us, how it could change your life, change your world tomorrow. And then I'm going to be talking to Tom Holland, the historian and, of course, podcaster, about Christianity, the idea that inverted everything, but what that inversion meant then and now and potentially in the future. At the end of this series, we're also going to be talking about the revolutionary ideas of the 21st century and looking around for them and seeing where they might lie now, maybe hidden, maybe undiscovered, and also where they might be in the future. It's not easy to predict. In fact, as we were talking about just now with Lea, it's impossible to predict where revolutions are going to come from, political, intellectual, moral, personal. None of us knows. But we can cast around, and we will cast around, and we will try to talk to people who think they've had a glimpse of where some of the revolutionary ideas of the future lie in the present. That's to come at the end of the series, and we will be open then to suggestions as well from people who might think they've got a glimpse of the future. This series is not going to try and take a stance on whether revolutions are good or bad. This is not a moral judgment about the need for or the need to prevent revolutionary change. We are just interested in all of the ways in which ideas change our world. And we think to understand that, you have always to go back and start with history. And so that's what we're going to do. As always, please follow us on Blue Sky, no longer on Twitter, at PPF Ideas, and you will discover there some of the things that are coming up. Do subscribe to our newsletter, which will accompany this series, free every fortnight. Each of the sequence of episodes will have a newsletter to accompany it with clips, indications of further reading, ideas about these ideas that we want to share with you. To subscribe to the newsletter, you just need to click on the link in the show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com. You can find everything you need to know about this podcast on our website, including how to sign up to PPF Plus, where you will get all of the bonus episodes that will be coming out alongside and as part of this series. You will also get ad-free listening and automatic sign-up to the newsletter. Next time, it's Agnes Callard and how Socrates didn't just change the world, but could change your life. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books. Past, Present, Future is part of the Airwave podcast network.